and it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer really standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on podcastufo.com. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. And our guest for this evening is Stanton Friedman. But before our guest, I have Randall Nickerson coming on. He's going to talk about the aerial phenomenon. And that's a film coming up. We're going to be talking all about that. Alejandro is taking the night off, so he'll be back next week. I want to tell you, I am actually heading out this evening for an entire month to Russia. Again. Yes, again. But I'm going to do the show from Russia. It's actually in the middle of the night for me, from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock in the morning. But that's all right. I'm dedicated to doing the show, so I'll be doing the show live from Russia. That's kind of interesting. Maybe I hope everything works okay. It should. I had an email come in, and I thought it was an interesting email. I do get a lot of email, and I don't mind. Anyone can email me at martin@podcastufo.com. So this one came in from a gentleman named Leon from North Carolina. Here we go. Martin, I really don't want to be negative because in this field, people tend to criticize. Everyone's fighting all the time. I don't want to fight with you, but I want you to know that your total disregard about the possibilities of connecting UFOs with anything else paranormal is so off base it shows and confirms that the fact that you have total ignorance on the lot of the UFO subject. Don't get me wrong, I praise you for starting your podcast, and I know you have a passion for the subject and all, but I would ask you to open your mind and don't stay in the box. A little one, I might add, to keep yourself in. I wish I had something better to say to you to do. Try hard, and you do try to be, you seem to be a nice guy, but you are totally clueless on the UFO subject. And you know what? I have to say thank you, Leon, for that. I am going to agree with you 100%. I feel like I am totally clueless. And thank you for that email. I have no problem with anyone, good or bad. I take them with the same grain of salt. So if you want to listen to the full shows, you can support the show. And our shows are always live. You can listen for free live on Podcast UFO every Wednesday at 8 to 10 Eastern Standard Time. You can also listen on the Dark Matter Digital Network, and that's every Thursday at 10 to midnight. All right, so we have Randy Nickerson coming on to talk about the aerial school phenomena. And unfortunately, we had audio capture trouble. So the first few minutes, we did not hear anything in this podcast with Randall Nickerson talking. I do apologize for that. Nothing I can do at this point. But we are going to be hearing him right now mid-sentence. You only missed a couple of seconds.
For an independent film, the average is about 7 or 8 years because you just don't have the financial means or the crew to get everything done. If you look at the credits on a film, there's hundreds of people involved, and right now we have 5, which is all volunteer. So that's where things are at right now.
All right. So you've been working on this film for the aerial school and a phenomenon that happened way back. John Mack interviewed people. You were going everywhere trying to reach these people who are now in their 20s, and I was able to meet Emily out in Phoenix. Mm-hmm. And she, having a face-to-face conversation with her, it was kind of spine-tingling, some of the things she told me, really amazing. Mm. And how difficult has it been for you to round up these people after all these years?
It's been fairly difficult. Not everybody wants to speak, and they're afraid of the ridicule factor, and getting in touch with them is one thing, but getting to them and interviewing them is a whole nother process. And but it's been great. I think I've interviewed quite a few people that were directly involved, and have been struck by the sincerity and impact that it's had on them.
Wow. Now, have some people just refused, they're just not interested in talking about it anymore?
Wow, I've had some. Yeah, I've had a couple that just. It's more of a fear of their reputation in their public perception.
Mm-hmm.
I've had one particular person that felt that it was something to do with the devil that happened there, which actually spoke to me like, well, something. There was no question anyway. I knew something had happened there for sure, but it was interesting. It's been interesting to see where people have taken it, in their own journey, whether they're dealing with it, not dealing with it, or how they have interpreted it and played it out in their lives.
Do you think that had to do something with the influence of their family? Like they would get home and say, I had this major thing happen, and their family just saying, it must be the devil or something like that? Yeah,
I do. I do think family and religion have played a big part in not all the kids, but a fair amount of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And how would you say, when you're talking to all these different people around the world, they scattered around the world basically.
They're all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah. And their story is, would you consider, like you said, they interpret it differently, but would you say there's a lot more consistencies than not?
Yeah, I think definitely the base story is consistent, and that's what's driven me to follow it. The basic facts of what occurred are similar across the board.
Yeah. Just to let the listener out there know, Randy's only going to be on for about 5 more minutes. So if anyone would like to call in and ask him a particular question about that, he was very, very involved with this way back. That's 603-967-4030 if anyone would like to call in. So
great.
When you actually started this film, did you have like this project in mind, or did it kind of unfold as you moved along in the filming?
It kind of unfolded because I first got the John Mack interviews of the children, and then the question became, is the school still there? I just became really fascinated by those interviews and wanted to see if there was more, which has taken quite a long time to retrieve all the other media that had covered that event during that time. So yeah, step by step, and then when I saw more material, I decided, I want to contact these kids, find out where they are, and speak to them about what happened, and so that was a whole journey of getting the names to start, and then finding, trying to locate them. So yeah, it has. It has been a journey and an evolving one. But now we just got back from Africa for the last time in November, and pretty much everything is shot. We've got all the archival that is needed, and just editing away and trying to raise funds for the finishing of the film.
All right, so we'll talk about that in a second. Now, when you're using old footage, is that something that actually you have to actually I know this may be a question you may not want to answer, but do you actually have to pay for footage?
Yes.
You do?
Yeah.
And so is that a costly part of this project?
It is, yeah. Archival is the most costly part. It's a big chunk of change for sure to pay for the use of people's footage. Yeah.
But I understand that, how important that is in this particular film.
It is.
Yeah. And if you can just kind of give a kind of an encapsulation of how this works, are you feeding, I'm just guessing here, but you're feeding in some of the archival of when Dr. Mack was interviewing these children, and then kind of like the journey on toward today? Is that a kind of where it's going?
Well, it is a mixture. I mean, it's the story played out, in real time back at that time, because there was enough footage and enough people shot, media organizations and individuals, that there's an enormous amount of material to actually tell the story in real time and then bounce to present day. So it's an unusual film. I just had an editor come in and say, "My God, I can't believe how much archival you have. That's incredible. To be even able to get that amount of archival on a single event is amazing." So I feel good about that. And but the story, it's going to be I just can't. It's really good. I'm not talking about myself. It's everybody involved, but it is a really powerful, moving story.
All right, and what people are going to want to know, I think mostly, is, and I know you're right in the middle of the editing process. We've had a couple conversations since then. And when do you think it will be released, and how will someone be able to see it?
Well, this year is the goal, and that really depends on funding, and things are moving along really pretty quickly. It's just I need more people on board, and that's where I'm running into difficulty. And I think it's probably likely going to enter the film festival circuit first, and then likely be on a network.
Good.
Yeah, and so that's the goal, and it's just it's the biggest part has been funding. It's unfortunate, but true.
Yeah, and I think I personally think this is, and I'll ask Stan later on what he thinks about this incident. Myself, I think it's one of the, the top, if I had to say the top 10 incidences. It's definitely within that, and maybe even close to the top of that. I think it's an important situation and an important film that you're doing. And how can someone be a part of this?
Well, we're running an Indiegogo campaign right now. People can go to Indiegogo and search Aerial Phenomena 2016. Ariel is ARIEL, and we also have a website, aerialphenomena.com. And yes, definitely looking for donations. We need to get another computer for a second editor, and so yes, it's I can't agree with you more as far as the story and the importance of it. It really needs to be told, and need as much support as possible.
Right.
And looking for private investors as well, for sure. And also we have a Facebook page that we have over 20,000 people on it, and that is Facebook Aerial School Documentary, if you want to chime in there. But definitely would appreciate any support, and it's definitely going to good cause and a group of really good people who are working with their hearts, and that's what this film is about. It's a really heart-driven film.
Just one more thing comes to mind. I can't imagine actually someone going through this at such a young age. Would you say that it profoundly affected a lot of their lives?
I think it. I think it depends on the person. Everybody deals with it differently, or has dealt with it differently. A lot of people have not thought about it, sort of blocked it out, and others have really gone into it and opened up to to what it really means in their lives. So I think I think you find that with anybody that's had these experiences, that there's a wide range of what the human being decides to do with it after it happens, how they deal with it, how they process their feelings, emotions, thoughts around it, and how it affects their worldview.
Yeah, I can totally understand that. And I know I just said that was probably the last question, but I have one more.
Okay.
I was speaking with Emily, she mentioned, the thought almost, just appearing in her mind about, we better take better care of the earth. And was that kind of a common theme that a lot of people felt?
I would say it was a small percentage. It wasn't a large percentage of the witnesses. But it was impactful, whatever was communicated there. And I in research, I've found that's also pretty common of a message that is been given is, some like another species telling us, we've got to clean our cage, so to speak.
And I agree, we do.
I think we do.
Yeah. All right, Randy. So someone can go to Indiegogo and they can just look this up and help you out. And if anyone's looking to invest, it's probably going to be this is going to end up being a big deal. I know you're an amazing photographer, and your work is very carefully done, and you take real pride in your work, whatever you do. So this is going to be a major film, and it's going to be a great film.
Thanks.
And I'm really, really looking forward to it.
I think it will. I really, really have a lot of. When I start talking about it, I get really excited because it's definitely going to have an impact for sure. And it's a story about people and this issue, human beings and what's out there.
Right. All right. So, Randy, thanks a lot. And sure we'll be talking soon.
Yeah. All the best to you.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye now.
Bye-bye. All right. So now, in just a second here, we got Stanton Friedman coming up. And a little bit about him. I'm sure if you're listening to the show, you already know who he is. He's a nuclear physicist lecturer, and he has been at this for a very long time. I think I remember him telling me about saving money and buying an extra book, and it was a UFO book, and that's how we get started. We can chat a little bit about that. But the one and only Stan Friedman, how are you?
Well, I'm fine here in beautiful downtown Fredericton, New Brunswick.
That's right. And I always forget, you're 1 hour, you start your day 1 hour before us here on the East Coast.
Well, of course, the sun rises from the east, so. We're 4 hours ahead of California, which Californians have trouble with.
Yeah. And I imagine you probably have a lot of trouble because you're asked to go on a lot of late night shows, so you have to keep some late hours yourself when you do that.
Well, it does happen, yes. Yeah, I try to get them earlier, but, But remember, I'm independent. I work for myself, so I don't have a boss to satisfy except me. And we do what we can when we can do it. And sometimes that's late, and what the heck. Yeah.
Now, Stan, we were in touch last week, and I want to I told the audience last week on my podcast, my show wasn't live last week. We had trouble with the server went down, and we couldn't run our show live. So I want to tell the listening audience, if you can bear with me, I'll kind of give them the story and tell them why I contacted you. Okay, so it's kind of a little bit of a lengthy story. I'll try to make it kind of short. I help out a good friend of mine in the auction business. I've been in the antiques and fine arts forever, and help out a good friend. We've known each other since we were little kids. And back in 2011, he asked me to come to his auction house and help him out, pick up a real important collection of Chinese porcelains. And he said the guy was a Chinese diplomat. He was a CIA, real important person. He was also a Japanese diplomat at one time. and a Flying Tiger, and had quite a career, and he passed away, and to go pick up his things from his son. So I spent the day back in 2011 in this gentleman's house, beautiful house, and full of these beautiful porcelains that I was picking up. I was there for several hours, and got to talking to him a little bit about his father. He said, yeah, my father was in the CIA, didn't talk much about it, so we really don't know too much, and, all that. All right, so I packed everything up, and we were going out the door, and I asked the people that were, loading the truck. Well, first of all, he said, take everything in the garage, and the only thing I saw interesting was a foot locker, and it was inscribed from when this gentleman was in the Flying Tigers, World War II. So they loaded it up. It went to the auction hall. So I was visiting the auction hall about 2 weeks ago, and they found this website, Podcast UFO. I don't know what they were doing in the office, but a girl came out and said, hey, you're into UFOs, and I saw one back in 1976. It was a triangle, this secretary in the office, a great story all on its own, she told me, and ended up being in the papers and everything at the time. So anyway, the owner, my friend, longtime friend, John, said, so you're into UFOs. I got something to show you. And he's walking around. He's trying to remember the name. He forgot all about that. I picked the items up. But it ended up being the Foot Locker that I picked up in the CIA's home back in 2011. And in the papers, he had just looked through real quickly one time, and he found the MJ-12 documents, the copy from probably from 1984, and that's what I'm going to ask Stan about. But old yellowed paper, and these copies come out, and I go, what the heck? Well, doing a little bit of research, this CIA retired. He was 64 years old in 1984, which brings up the question, why would he have those, if those documents were copies that came out in 1984 that you were involved in, Stan? It is curious why this ex-CIA at that time, unless he had a specific interest in UFOs, would have these documents. What did you think about that whole situation?
Well, okay, let's go back to how we got them. I had been working with Bill Moore on Roswell. And then I moved back here to Fredericton. He was living then in California. And I had put him together with Jamie Chandray, who was a television producer in L.A. And so they were working together, and Bill would keep me informed. And then he got contacted by some kind of an insider who intimated that he wanted to help him out, a guy with intelligence background. And so they had numerous contacts. And then one day, a roll of film shows up in Jamie's mailbox. And a 35-millimeter film. You guys remember back when people used to use film in cameras, And so Bill processed the film. A lot of people did their own stuff way back then. And on it were 8 pages of top-secret material about Operation Majestic 12, specifically a briefing for President-elect Eisenhower, dated in November before he became president. And page 8 was a letter, a memorandum from President Truman to James Forrestal, who was had been Secretary of the Navy, then became the first Secretary of Defense, and so forth. Anyway, it was instructing Forrestal to handle, I'm not even thinking of the right word to use it, to establish this group called Operation Majestic 12 to report accountable only to the president. And it was dated on the only day there was somebody else mentioned, Vannevar Bush, who was an outstanding scientist and headed a lot of early research and development programs. And the question, of course, was whether these documents were genuine. The briefing document named the 8 people who were on this, the 12 people, MJ-12, who were on this Operation Majestic 12. But there was a problem. There were 6 military and 6 civilian, and most of the civilians were scientists. These were all outstanding people. But there was one guy listed as a member of this group who made no sense at all, and that was Dr. Donald Menzel, Harvard University professor of astronomy, who was a total debunker, wrote 3 anti-UFO books, and was constantly giving speeches and so forth, saying it's all malarkey. Now, how could he be part of a group that knew about crash saucers, Roswell, alien bodies, etc.? So we were very hesitant about going public until we didn't want anybody to be able to stand up and say, hey, gotcha, guys, I put that together. So we took our time looking at stuff, and I did run across, I was checking, let's get the facts straight before putting our mouths in gear kind of thing. And I was studying the papers of Dr. Bush at the Library of Congress Manuscript Division in Washington, and I found something in there listing under, there were a lot of stuff, and listed under Menzel, and there was a lawyerly letter, a letter from a prominent lawyer in Boston, thanking Bush for making sure that Donald Menzel didn't get deprived of his security clearance and wasn't declared unpatriotic. And so what the heck is Menzel doing with the security clearance, and why would he have a hearing? And I looked in Washington Post, New York Times, neither one of them mentioned these hearings. It would have been 1950. So I called the lawyer and found out, there's 1,000 pages about that hearing in the Menzel papers at Harvard. Oh, okay. So I contacted the Harvard archives and found out that I had to get written permission from 3 different people to look at his papers. So it was not the kind of thing you could walk in off the street on. So I sent the letters and got the permissions and arranged the Fund for UFO Research, gave me a research grant. And I went up to Harvard. And looking at the titles, there wasn't, I knew most of his UFO stuff was at the American Philosophical Society Library in Philadelphia. It's still there. Some of it at the University of Denver, where he had done his undergraduate work. So where am I going to look? There was something with the label, of file folder labeled JFK. And I hit pay dirt. I was very lucky. I found, to my total astonishment, I didn't like Menzel when he was alive. Because, any college freshman could have shown how wrong he was at his identification of cases. I mean, this is a prominent Harvard professor, and that, I wasn't impressed in the one contact I had with him. So I'm looking at these papers, and son of a gun, there are letters from Menzel to Jack Kennedy. Now, they knew each other very well, as it turns out. Kennedy had been on the board of overseers at Harvard, and his area of interest was astronomy, and he and Menzel got to know each other, and they often had breakfast together, walking from Jack's office to the university. Anyway, here's a letter, for example, one of the first ones that I saw, from Menzel to Kennedy, saying that there is one area, Kennedy had just been elected, and there is one area where I may be able to be of assistance to you. It's about the National Security Agency. I have a longer continuous connection with them of anybody in the country, about 30 years now, them and the Navy predecessors. When we are properly cleared to each other, I can tell you more. That's what he's telling the president.
Wow.
And then I'm reading more and finding more, and it turns out Menzel there was an unpublished autobiography, you can see why it wasn't published, in which he said that he did classified work for many companies, many agencies. And it turns out, not only with the NSA, but it turns out he was a cryptologist. And there's an article published about 7 years ago. I mean, I'm talking about back in the 80s, but 7 years ago, somebody who got to look at that same unpublished autobiography did an article on Donald Menzel's contribution to cryptology. And there were lots of them. And it turns out that he even organized classes at 7 different women's colleges around Harvard in the early 40s, because they were looking for women to be cryptologists. They wouldn't get drafted, of course, which was an advantage. And he thought that they were better at it than men. And so here's an article patting him on the back for his major contributions, which nobody had known about. And when I published an article in the Center for UFO Studies as a journal, The Double Life of Donald Menzel, I had a number of people give me a hard time. Stan, he was a debunker. He couldn't have known anything about Roswell. This is all baloney. Somebody just put his name there and so forth. And none of these people in all these years, as far as I've been able to tell, ever went to Harvard to look at his papers. That's typical of the debunker attitude, you know. So the MJ-12 stuff, I published a book, Top Secret Magic, M-A-J-I-C. That was the security markings on this thing. I've published several papers. I published a final report on Operation Majestic 12 on the basis of my research efforts. It was exciting. And what I found was this, that there are loads of MJ-12 documents out there, maybe 100. But almost all of them are fraudulent. And I showed that some of them were fraudulent. Let me give you an example. One of the documents says, it says that General Wiedemeyer was heavily involved in this stuff. And I called the Marshall Archives because I knew enough about Wiedemeyer that he had been a China expert. He had spent a year in China before for General Marshall, who was the chief of staff at the time. This is back in the time when, you know, what are we going to do about China? Mao Zedong and the whole business. It was complicated. We didn't know where we were going with that. So I checked on that, and I called the Marshall Library. I've been to 20 archives. I'd like to go to the first-hand data, you know. And I asked the archivist whom I had met, I said, can you think of any reason why General Wiedemeyer should be part of MJ-12? He was a China expert, wasn't he? Not a technologist. He said, no, I can't either. Well, why don't you check his book? I didn't know he'd written a book, I must say. The Wiedemeyer Reports. He said, oh, yeah, it was a bestseller back in 1957. So I got very lucky. I called the University of New Brunswick Library, which is less than 2 miles from my house, mind you. Mentioned the book, and they had it. I went over, took it out. I have borrowing privileges. I get a card every year. And started looking through it. There were 3 letters, I'll call them, documents would be better, I guess, that clearly had been used as models for somebody who made a few changes here and there and Xeroxed the handwritten part and had spread out as MJ-12 documents. I found 3 of them in this one book. And all you had to do was look at them and you realize this is the guy made a few changes and put this out. So I went back to the library later, and not that same day. I looked in the same department where I'd found Wiedemeyer's book and found another book and found a couple more of these phony documents. So I'm on the one hand, a total believer that there really was an Operation Majestic 12, and that there are at least 3 legitimate documents, the original 2, and then we got some letters or postcards suggesting we look at Washington, and Jamie and Bill went there and found another document, the Cutler-Twining memo.
Right.
Bobby Cutler was Ike's national security advisor, basically. General Twining was a member of MJ-12. He had been, he went on to be Chief of Staff of the Air Force. He'd been head of the Air Materiel Command at Wright Field, which is where Project Blue Book was. And he was certainly involved in the early days of Roswell. And so, this memo was, it didn't say anything important. It's from Cutler telling Twining that a briefing will take place at a somewhat different time than had originally been planned. Change your plans accordingly, basically. But the subject line said MJ-12, Special Studies Briefing, something like that. MJ-12, wow. And the question is whether the document was legitimate. And it doesn't have a signature on it. Well, I had other documents from Cutler. On some of them, it says original signed by, so this one wasn't signed, and it didn't have that. And Phil Klass challenged me on the document. It's a funny story. He sent me a kind of snide letter saying, probably you didn't notice that the Cutler Twining memo was done in the large pica type. But the NSC used only a leap type, and here are 9 documents to prove that. I challenge you to find any other genuine documents from the NSC done in the same size and style type. And I'm offering you $100 each up to a maximum of 10. And they've got to meet certain criteria. There were the signatures and dates and so forth and so on. Okay. So this was a crazy challenge. And I'll tell you why in a minute. But basically, I went to my files. I found 20 documents done in the same size, but not meeting all its criteria. But they were done in pica type, no question about it. I sent him copies. I was playing games with him, really. He accepted 2. But I was going to the Eisenhower Library, so I knew I'd have a chance to find more. And I went, and I found 14, copied them, sent him copies, and an invoice for $1,000, maximum of 10, he said. And he paid me. He told everybody about challenging me and nobody about paying me. And amazingly, in the class papers in Philadelphia, American Philosophical Society Library, there is no Stanton Friedman file. We corresponded for 20 years. There's 35 boxes of papers and letters and so forth, and it's as if we had no connection. I don't think he wanted anybody to know about it. But here's the really crazy thing is that he had never, I checked with the Eisenhower Library. I spent weeks there altogether. He had never been there before or after this. Now, it turns out they had about 250,000 pages of NSC materials. Now, how can any rational person generalize from 9 to 250,000? Well, these 9 are done in elite type. He got them by mail, incidentally. Well, then, obviously, all the rest are. That's nonsense. Totally ridiculous. And so that's typical of the objections that have been raised to the documents. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up.
Right.
And there are a whole bunch of these silly things.
Yeah. I do want to ask you a couple more questions about this. But first of all, just to follow up for the listeners as far as this particular gentleman, why he had the copies, I am trying to find that out. Currently, the son is vacationing in the Caribbean. So when I actually get to talk to him again, I will ask him if his father, first of all, had an interest in UFOs. I mean, that would be an answer for why he would have those documents, especially if they came out in 1984. I did look into, someone asked if I should get them checked because they did indeed actually have copiers in 1953. They were very rare and only a few places had them. But I did contact a document specialist in Illinois. They said they could actually test and date the paper and test and date the ink with what was out there at the time. However,
you can't do that because we don't have the originals. We have a roll of film. Right.
No. I'm talking about this all had to do, Stan, when I saw the copies, and I know they're from the film, but I looked into it first to see if these copies that I ended up forwarding to you could possibly be from an earlier time, and they take a retainer of $2,500 before they test the paper, even page 1.
Well, yeah.
But since we talked after that, and I sent you the copies, you think they're actually copies of what you had from the roll of film?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. If you look at them and look at what I've got, and it's been published. These are not rare birds. I mean, my book has Top Secret Magic, as I said, all 8 pages, not just the 4. You sent me 4. Were there more than 4?
No, there were 4. Yep.
Okay. Well, there's a total of 8, and that didn't include the Truman Forrestal memo. But I published it in my final report on MJ-12. That was in 90 maybe. And it's in my Flying Saucers in Science. They're interesting reading, you know.
They are. And the thing... I also want to tell the listener out there, I did, because of the curiosity, why on earth would, you know, this ex-CIA have these documents? That's still the puzzling, and I'll probably find a simple answer. But these were in his footlocker with 1953 and 1955, 1944, World War II when he was a flying tiger. All these papers, this is where, why would he put them in there is another question. Why would he put it in with all his other papers? You know,
good question.
It is a good question, and you know, I did have someone from the west, out west, had a conspiracy. Well, maybe someone seeded him in there to, you know, have someone find it and start another conspiracy. Who knows? It's all
I don't know.
Interesting questions that will be answered. So, Stan, the question I have for you, I think I've heard you say a number of times, you think there are possibly a couple of these that may be authentic, and do you think that the
three primary, the Cutler-Twining memo, the Truman-Forrestal memo, and the Eisenhower briefing document, I think these are all genuine.
And why would you think someone would mix in all the other fakes?
Well, they didn't mix in all the other. They got distributed out in the world, but they weren't part of these documents. In other words, I think what there's another fact I should put in here. The last surviving member of Operation Majestic 12, the original group, died in 1984. And it was and his obituary was in the New York Times. So if somebody was waiting for the last death, and then he sent us the roll of film. That's all I can say. Remember, the guy was breaking the law. It's against the law to photograph and distribute classified material. No question about that. So people say, why didn't he come forward? He's admitting he committed a felony. But I also found out that the Cutler-Twining memo, for example, that box had been handled, again, after the death of the last survivor. There was just a 3-month period in there. And so there are a whole bunch of details in these documents. That's why I wrote a whole book and several papers and so forth, because people have raised all sorts of objections, and I've tried to deal with every single one to see which way things go, the facts. Give me the facts, man. Who was it? Joe Friday said that? I guess. This is Stan Thursday or something.
I watched that. Dragnet, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, they are interesting reading. So do you think that the others, though, that came out, I mean, someone really put a lot of energy into...
Well, you say someone. I think my best solution is that somebody at headquarters, Air Force Office of Special Investigation, said, what are we going to do about this? We can't make a big noise and say that they're genuine. You don't prosecute somebody for distributing classified material, because then you're admitting that it's legitimate. You know, you're behind the 8 ball. So I think the simplest explanation is some class of students was asked, let's see if we can manufacture phony documents. And I talked to an ex-CIA man, Carl Flock, he's dead now. And I asked, there's a signature on the Truman Forrestal memo. And it's pretty close match to one that was on a memo from Van Bush's office. And I was the one who found it because I was looking for that sort of stuff. And I wondered whether somebody, why is somebody doing this? But my best answer, I asked Carl if that signature could have been lifted by the CIA. He said, of course. And if you remember the story of capturing that Nazi and taking him back to Israel, the team that did that had with them a guy who was a documents guy because they needed exit visas and, all kinds of stuff. So they had to be good. So there's a big business in disinformation. And if you put out crap, and enough people say, well, this one's phony, that one's phony, now they must all be phony. In other words, I don't think one guy was running around doing this. I think it was a major effort. Because, let's face it, if these documents are real, even just the three that I'm talking about, that I say are real, then that solves all the problems. Are aliens real? Yes. Are they visiting? Yes. Did Roswell happen as described in the document? Yes. Those are incredible new truths. The government obviously isn't about to release those. I mean, a lot of people don't know. The NSA, for example, because of a lawsuit under Freedom of Information and so forth, they admitted to having documents, and they finally released some because there was a change in the official regulations and so forth. Finally, we got, many years later, we got 156 pages of top secret Umbra NSA UFO documents. Wow! The only problem was you can read one sentence per page. Everything else is whited out. Now, the CIA had released 800 pages up through secret, but no top secret material. But finally I got some from them, and they're all blacked out. You know, you can read 6 words on a page if you like, kind of thing. These are all old documents, and I get people saying, oh, there's no classified information. They're not withholding anything. Well, fine, get me clean copies of these 156 pages over here, and of those dozens of pages. And we have to remember what General Carol Bollinger said. He was an Air Force general who was working on a lunar excursion module in 1969. You may remember we landed on the moon, and as he told me when I talked to him, I don't know if anybody else had talked to him, and he's dead now. He can't guest on your show. He said, at least when we landed, at least I didn't have to work 12-hour days anymore. Anyway, he was asked, because the University of Colorado, the Condon Report, had recommended that Project Blue Book be closed. That was in early '69. And he was asked by the Air Force. He had no previous connection with UFOs, Blue Book, or anything like that. What should we do about Project Blue Book? Because the Condon had said, it wasn't doing anything for intelligence or technology or, why not just close it using valuable manpower? And I tend to agree with him that it wasn't doing something. Anyway, Bollinger put out a memo and at the end of '69, which wound up being responsible for the closure of Project Blue Book. We didn't get that memo. Bob Todd, a researcher who filed hundreds of Freedom of Information Act requests, got it with a pile of other stuff, probably inadvertent. Anyway, we saw a copy in 1979, 10 years later, and it was shocking. In it, Bollinger said, it's not a long memo, maybe 5 pages, something like that. He said, reports of UFOs which could affect national security are made in accordance with JNAP 146, or Air Force Manual 55-11, and are not part of the Blue Book system. That's an extraordinary statement. And 2 paragraphs later, he says, if we close Project Blue Book, the public won't have a government place to report sightings. However, as previously noted, reports which could affect national security will continue to be investigated using the procedures designed for that purpose. Now, what the heck does that mean? JNAP 146 or Air Force Manual 55-11, but where did those go? And I'm saying they went to Majestic 12. It's the obvious answer. And when I called Bollinger, I asked him, I said, look, it sounds to me like you're saying, told him that I'd had a clearance for 14 years and was very interested in UFOs and read his memo with great interest. I said, it sounds like you're saying that there are 2 separate communication channels. One for reports that could affect national security. As I told him, I had a report a few weeks ago of a saucer going down the runway at a Strategic Air Command base where nuclear weapons were stored. I would presume, by definition, that's national security. And then if my wife and I are driving down the street and see a UFO, big deal. It happens all the time. No reason not to report that. And he agreed with me. 2 separate communication channels. Now, what you have to think about is there should be one group, not 3, not Army, Navy, Air Force. And incidentally, one of the crazy things is the Office of Naval Intelligence says, oh, we don't have anything about UFOs. Well, I've talked to loads of Navy guys who tell me about sightings and reports that went in. Where did they go? Well, my view is that there are 2 important areas where you need highly competent technical people with clearances. One is examination of crash saucer wreckage. Not just Roswell, but Aztec and the plains of San Agustin and a few others that have happened. You shouldn't have 3 groups. There should be 1 group. Secondly, we have means of monitoring the flights of UFOs, not just radar on the ground and radar in the sky, but aircraft chasing UFOs with their radar on and electromagnetic measuring gear, if you will. And you need somebody to analyze that stuff. In other words, how does the color change as the speed changes? And did it really make a right-angle turn? And, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you want to find out about. And so we've never seen that information. It's not just the old NSA stuff that's gone, but anything that could affect national security. And people say, well, what do you mean national security, Stan? I said, every country in the world would love to be able to duplicate the flying behavior. The ability to hover, to move extremely rapidly, to make right-angle turns all silently, to go up and down, backwards, forwards. That's an ideal weapons delivery system, especially if you can do it silently without any visible external engines. Hey, that's pretty special. And there are other aspects of that. Suppose you find a better way of detecting the presence of vehicles in the atmosphere besides radar. We know that you can make things stealthy. So maybe there's another technique that can be used if your enemies come up with a stealth approach. Remember, we spent $10 billion, Lockheed did, on developing a stealth aircraft. That's a lot of dough.
Especially
but it's valuable. Yeah, it's valuable if you can do that, if you can avoid the enemy's radars. So I'm saying that, just another UFO sighting, no big deal. But technology involved, very big deal. And there's no reason to distribute that around. You have one central group, and it's accountable only to the president. I mean, that was then. Who knows what happened to the group afterward? And once the name MJ-12 was made public, that they're surely going to change the name.
So
that's
do you
standard
think
practice?
Right. Do you think nothing has really changed as far as UFO sightings and all that? So do you think there's most likely some type of organization as was still in
no
place?
Question. Remember, MUFON gets 1,000 reports a month. Sometimes 800, sometimes 1,100. Okay, but so there's stuff still going on, and it may well be that they have changed what they do in response to what we do. If they find that we can detect them, they may want to. The aliens may want to stay out of our gun sights, so to speak. Now, I must admit, over the years, I have talked to 7 different people who quietly tell me about being in the military at a base where a pilot was sent up, scrambled to chase UFOs, and never came back. And that's kind of scary, and I have no reason to doubt them. But in addition, with Frank Ficino, who's written a book about the Flatwoods Monster case, he went through the New York Times files and found that, would you believe, there were 200 fatal military aircraft crashes in the early 50s. 200. And 5 of the pilots had flown over 100 missions in Korea, where there were MiGs trying to shoot them down, Those weren't fun trips. They come back to the United States, no MiGs, and 5 of them crashed. And New York Times, I mean, they had to be good pilots to avoid being taken down over there.
Mm-hmm.
And the New York Times used words like disintegrated and disappeared in some of these cases. So I think we know from several cases that have gotten a lot of publicity, English cases and stuff where pilots chased UFOs and their systems went off and came back on when the UFO left and stuff like that. So somebody was paying attention. And the case that I got most involved in, I guess, was a guy, an NSA listening post in Boca Chica, down Florida, or the closest base to Cuba. And I talked to a guy who had been stationed there. And one night, all they do is listen. You got to be a trilinguist. You got to speak Spanish, English, and Russian, because the Russians were running the show back in the 60s there. And one day, they hear the noise on the radio, so to speak, that a saucer was coming in from the northeast to the southwest, Mach 1, 30,000 feet. And the Russian Cuban Air Defense Command scrambles a couple of planes. They go up, they confront the UFOs, in effect tell them, get the heck out of our airspace. I don't know how you do that in Russian, but anyway. And it didn't faze the UFOs at all, so they radio the ground, what should we do? Shoot it down. Those decisions, I was told, normally were made by the Russians on the ground, not by the Cubans in the air. Okay, so the lead pilot radios that he's got a radar lock on, his missiles are armed, and then they're screaming over the airwaves from the second pilot that the first plane just disintegrated, exploded. And the UFO went straight up to 90,000 feet and went to the southeast at Mach several. And the guy said, we did what we normally do. We send a transcript of the conversation. And we get back instructions which were strange. They said, send the original tape. He said, that never happened. I said, do you think they want to be finding out what happened in that minute or so when between the lock-on and all the rest of that? He says, I don't know, but all I know is we sent the tape. But think about that case for a minute. They didn't take nasty action against the pilots until the pilots made an effort. You can tell when the other guy's got a lock-on you. Mm-hmm. And so you don't have much choice. You've got a few seconds to do something. You don't want them splattering you with a missile. So Zappo.
Wow.
And what can I say? If I have heard 7 guys, because I'm a big mouth and talk all over the place, surely there are more cases than that.
Yeah. Now, there was a time where, I had a past guest on that mentioned that there was a time where that was the stance, shoot them down, for the U.S. Air Force.
The orders were issued in 1952 to all military planes. If they don't land when instructed to do so, shoot them down.
Wow. And there are a lot of cases where they actually, according to what I've heard, I don't know if it's true or not, that they actually did fire with no results.
Well, I've heard that too. It's almost as if there was an invisible barrier.
Right.
I'd like to know how to do that.
Yeah. So getting back, I just want to, we're right at the top of the hour, and getting back one more time about the MJ-12 papers. Yeah. You kind of had your last stand on those back, you said, somewhere in the 90s when you said the final report. Are you still...
but I wrote a book well after that, and I've written more papers, MUFON papers, and so forth.
Are you still... do you still think there's a possibility that there will be more unveiled about this eventually?
Well, I have no idea. Certainly the original group is all dead, and certainly there must have been all hell break loose when these documents were made public, the genuine ones. Mm. There was somebody helping us out, Bill and Jamie went to the library because there were postcards received that suggested that they go there to find the Cutler-Twining memo. And the postal code, the post office box on the postcard was box 187 or 189, I forget which.
In Albuquerque?
And they didn't.
Right?
No. This is from the postcard that was sent from some mysterious person.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And return address was New Zealand. I mean, ridiculous. But there were enough clues in the card to suggest that they go to the library where they found the Cutler-Twining memo. I had found out, I had talked to an archivist who told me that they were classification reviewing the Air Force intelligence old files. And I told Bill and Jamie when these were completed, and the postcard had other things in it, Reese's Pieces. Well, the guy, the archivist that I had dealt with, was named Reese. And there were a couple of other things. So Bill and Jamie went to Washington, especially after I found out that they were declassifying this particular file. And they were going through that stuff. It was just hot off the press, so to speak. And in box 189, the same one that was listed on the post office. No, just a coincidence, but I don't think so.
Now, there were, you heard like skeptics or debunkers saying that they actually, planted the document or pretended that they got the document there and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, I've responded to every one of those suggestions. Mm-hmm. There's stuff in the documents that we didn't know until long after we got them. For example, the Cutler-Twining memo isn't signed. We found out much later that Cutler was out of the country. Couldn't have signed. If they had been signed, they would have been phony, you see,
right.
If it had been signed. And there were several other details like that. Dr. Kevin Randall said the documents were obviously phony because in the briefing document it says Admiral Roscoe Hillencoter, who was only a rear admiral. Obviously the document's fraudulent. Well, all the military ranks were generic ranks. General instead of lieutenant or major or 4-star or whatever, brigadier general, and a bunch of stuff like that. And it was standard practice. And I checked when I went to the Eisenhower Library. There was a whole file of memcons, memorandum of conversations, from General Goodpaster, who was Ike's staff secretary. After meetings at the White House, he would write up basically minutes of the meetings with recommendations and so forth. And at the beginning, he would list the attendees. And he listed himself, General Goodpaster. There's only a brigadier general. Everybody else, they used generic ranks. And at the Eisenhower, you can find out what rank people are. They got lots of data of that sort. And I asked a couple of archivists, does this bother you, this use of generic ranks? This is standard practice. Ike used that. And sure enough, I went to an Ike book that I have. He used generic ranks. So I don't know why Kevin, who had more than 20 years in the military, jumped to that conclusion. That's a false conclusion. And there are a whole bunch of these sorts of things. The typeface on the date in a couple of these was different or discontinuous from the rest. And I did something, and I asked the Truman Library, I said, is there anybody still alive from that time frame? Oh, yeah, George Elsey, he's in the Washington area. Worked for Truman the whole time he was in the White House. Okay, I'm glad it wasn't Tom Smith, There are too many of them, but I located George, and I asked him, I said, look, I've got some documents from back in the early 50s, and I have no idea whether they're genuine or not, but you were there at the time. Could I send them to you and call you later to get your opinion about them? Sure. So I did that and waited a few weeks and then called him, and I suddenly realized if he knows anything, he can't tell me. So I'm going to ask my questions sort of backwards. I didn't ask him whether the documents phony. Did you see anything about the documents that would lead you to believe that they weren't true? He could answer that.
Oh.
I said, you saw that list of people. He recognized all the names. And do you have any reason to think that Truman would not have appointed those people because he thought that Mr. A or General A was an idiot? He said, no, those were all the right people he trusted. He told me that the guy I thought wrote the memo, the Cutler-Twining memo, James Lay, was the executive secretary of the National Security Council. He and Cutler sat next to each other at all the meetings, and each got copies of everything the other people did. And I suggested to him, well, I did find out that James Lay met with Ike in the morning of the date of the memo, and there was a phone conversation. They keep records of this sort of thing later in the day. Could he have written the memo? We said, well, of course. And especially after I found a memo from Cutler to Lay saying, keep things moving out of my in-basket while I'm gone. Mm-hmm. So I got all kinds of validations, details. The Truman Forrestal memo, I asked him, could somebody else have provided the memo, not being typed in Truman's office? He said, most of what a president signed comes from someplace else. And he certainly trusted Forrestal and Bush. And then I found that the date of that memo is the only date in an 8-month period when the three of them, the president, Forrestal, and Bush, met together. The one day. And I didn't know that until later, and I asked the people at the library, did anybody else ever ask you that question? No.
Wow.
How did they know? So there's all kinds of details. Top Secret Magic has most of them, my book. It's listed on my website, www.stantonfriedman.com. And you get an autograph if you get it from me instead of Amazon.
Oh, there you go. Stan, if I'm going to offer the live listener, if you want to call in at 603-967-4030. If someone has to call in, if someone calls in, I will unfortunately have to interrupt the conversation because there's no way for me to put them on hold or anything. I'm not that sophisticated as some shows are.
Oh, well.
Yeah. So now one of the questions I thought about, you mentioned these redacted documents, blacked out or whited out. I know they started writing them out.
Out of the whited out.
Yeah. Yeah, that happened after you started showing all the ones that were blacked out.
Yes, that's right.
They caught that. So when these are blacked out like that, a lot of times you'll hear I don't want to say skeptics or anyone out there will say, well, what's the only thing that's blacked out is something that would, risk someone's exposure to, something they were involved in or addresses, or personal information. It's just too much blacked out, isn't it, on a page?
Well, much too much. And as a matter of fact, the guy tried to do that, Bill Nye, the science guy.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
He tried to make that argument. He says, the only thing, you guys talk about cover-ups, the only thing that's blacked out is the guy's address here. Of course it's blacked out. You don't want that. I said, well, as it happens, that's simply not true. It may be on that document, but here's a page out of my book, Flying Saucers and Science. I happen to have it with me. And I quickly managed to find the page. I said, here's a page from the CIA, as it happens. And you can see that it's all blacked out except 6 words up here. It's not just an address or anything. And I've got pages, one of my favorite pages of CIA stuff at the top. It's all blacked out. At the top, there's a little white box that says, deny in toto.
So why
that's malarkey, in other words.
Why do they bother even releasing them when they're that?
Well, because there are laws about freedom of information
and
stuff like that. And so, sure, they violate the laws, but they're supposed to respond within 10 days to any Freedom of Information Act request, 10 working days. And I've waited as long as 2 years for stuff.
Something that just occurred to me, what if two different people in different periods of time request the same document? Does it come out redacted exactly the same way, or have you ever been
They
able...
have a master, that's all. But there's something funny about that when it comes to the MJ-12 one. The guy who's got the best possible website, John Greenwald,
Yes.
the Black Vault, he just recently put out a summary document which lists, he's tried to get the FBI files of all the MJ-12 guys. And he didn't get all of them, but what he found out was that there are several that they've disappeared. They're gone, unavailable, can't be found. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but and also what's really happened is a lot of those 156 pages, somebody tried to get a set of those. We don't have the originals anymore. Sorry. What can I say? What do you do?
How is that? You do hear of that. You hear that actually heard John speak out in Phoenix, I think, and mentioned something about them saying that they lost them.
Yeah, that's true. And what can you do about it? You can't say, well, let me in and I'll look for them in your files. No way, Jose.
Now, do you think that it is just so troublesome that, for one thing, you mentioned just the massive volume of papers in some archive, and there must be such a huge mass volume. I don't know exactly how these things are filed, but do you think that's the reason they take so long and say things like, these were lost or something like that because it's just so intense to find them, or do you think they're just avoiding the situation as much as possible?
Well, I think they're lying or maybe tossing them out, and then they could honestly say, "Oh, we don't have those."
Yeah.
Now, it's easy for the government to cover things up, and there are huge amounts of paper, but all these separate installations are independent. But what happens, there's a tricky thing here. If you go to the Eisenhower Library and you're looking at somebody's papers, you'll find a sheet in there that says this document is classified, memo from Smith to Jones, and give you a date. And you can make a mandatory classification review request. And you have to mark it in the file so that the guys there can find it and stuff. There's a procedure. And they do it. And so they submit it back, let's say, to the NSA. But the NSA can say, well, the CIA might be interested in this. Let's send it over to them. And, of course, it goes to the bottom of the pile. And so they can spend a lot of time sending these documents around and frustrating everybody.
Yeah.
What can I say?
Well, I think it's kind of like, the lawyer's tactic. Like, how long can we drag this out so they'll finally give up?
Yeah. Well, let me tell you a little experience I had. Many years ago, at least 10, maybe more than that, requested my FBI file. And I gave them my history, where I was born, my full name, date of birth, and I mentioned in there my parents' names. And I mentioned in there that I'd had a Q clearance for this 14-year period. I want my file. And I sent a similar request to the CIA at about the same time. I heard first from the FBI, we don't have a file on you. Well, I know they were lying because there were people who called me, Stan, why is the FBI asking me about you? The security clearance has to be reviewed every 5 years. So there were 3 times when I went through the process and they had to check with people and all that sort of stuff. So I know the FBI did that. And I know they were lying. Well, maybe you can say, no, they're just incompetent, Stan. That's okay. Then I heard from the CIA. And all they had on me, they said, is a negative name check request from the FBI. And they sent me a copy of it, a little squib of paper about 4 inches square, and it had a file number on it. And they had responded that they didn't have any negative information about me. So I sent a copy of that then to the FBI guy and said, could you please check your files? Again, it would appear that the CIA says you have a file on me. I get back a polite letter saying, we have rechecked our files and find we do have a file on you, but it's classified. So I write him another letter. I'd like to know the size of the file and the level of classification. Sorry, that information is classified too. So you realize they say they have nothing.
Yeah.
So if they don't want to give stuff out, they don't. Now remember that a 1950 Canadian memo said by Wilbur Smith said that UFO subject is the most classified one in the United States, even more so than the H-bomb. So it may well be.
Well, that would totally make sense, actually. You know, if you really think about it, with all the things you talked about earlier, the things that you could drop a bomb without, you know, any noise, a noiseless propulsion and all that. Sure, it would definitely be classified like that. I don't want to, you know, the only way I can say this is to put the gentleman's name out there, and you know, I'm not wanting to really put you on the spot, but I want to kind of get a general overall opinion of what you think about Chase Brandon's claims of seeing the Roswell files, since we've been talking about, you know, ex-CIA.
Well, I know somebody in Washington. Lee Spiegel talked to him. He's a reporter for Huffington Post, a very good on ufology and stuff. And I think he probably did see it. What caught me about that, incidentally, is my movie UFOs Are Real. The director was Brandon Chase. And when I heard this name, I was thinking, come on, you know, that's really his name.
Wow. Yeah.
So yeah, I was reasonably satisfied with him, and remember, he didn't hand out any documents. He just said he'd seen something. And it wouldn't surprise me at all. But everywhere you look, they're withholding documents on UFOs.
But the thing that puzzles me in that whole situation is, and you would probably know much more than I would, but I wouldn't think that a file box would have a title on it. It would just have a number, a file number, or something like that.
The archival boxes frequently do have information on the outside.
They do.
I'll call it a label. Box 187 or 189, Air Force Intelligence Files, and then there's a subcategory. I've looked at a lot of boxes, and archive boxes are different, and the filing is not consistent everywhere. I've been to 20 archives, and there are differences from facility to facility. I'll tell you one thing. They watch you like a hawk when they bring a box out to you. Also have a limit. They can bring 8 boxes or 10 or something like that. But you better only open one at a time and take out only one folder at a time. And they're looking up there while you're back here. And so you got to be careful. And something happened at the National Archives. Somebody, it turned out, had stolen some documents that had valuable signatures on them. Somebody had slipped them out.
Right.
So they improved their security quite considerably. They check everybody leaving, and, you know.
Yes. And I find that I do a lot with historical documents and historical societies and things like that. I was just in Massachusetts Historical Society. Same thing. They were watching me very carefully when I was trying to research something. So I think that is across the board, and you do get, of course, presidential signatures, especially Jefferson or someone like that. You know, there are people that would take that in a second if they can get, $10,000 for a document or something.
Well, they only found out about this guy who'd been stealing stuff when a document salesman or gatherer, what do you call it, a collector, an expert, came to them and said he'd been offered and he'd seen it. I forget whose signature it was. And he said, I've never seen that before. And it turned out it was from the archive, and it wasn't there.
Wow.
They knew what it was, and the guy got caught. But only because, look, decent people don't want things like that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's part of our national heritage. You know, if you got a George Washington signature on a document, it should be where historians can look at it. Don't you think?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Someone wrote in the message board, and I always, maybe I'm confusing something or they're confusing something, but Stan, I always remember you saying that you have personally never had a sighting, and this person saying that you actually did with Kathy Martin or someone?
Well, that's a funny story. Kathy and I were being interviewed. We were on a hillside near where the Hill abduction had taken place. It was nighttime. The guy was down on the road, the narrow road with a camera, and we were up on the hill, and they had some lights on us. And he said, "Hey, what's that behind you?" You don't normally interrupt an interview, you know. And we looked up, and there were some lights up there. It was dark, but there were a couple of lights, and then there were a couple of more. And we don't know what they were. We eventually, we stopped shooting, and as it happens, when we went back to the hotel, two of the girls at the hotel, we'd like to talk to you guys. We had a sighting today. So they apparently, and they described it in the same way. Now, Peter Jeremiah, whose MUFON New Hampshire was at that time, did some checking for us, and he thinks they were National Guard planes from Vermont. This happened. So I don't think we saw an alien spacecraft.
Yeah.
So both stories are true.
Okay. One of the things you hear a lot of times that people will say, well, you don't have to, and I think I even heard it on Larry King when you were on there with Bill Nye, which I thought was pretty arrogant, actually.
Yes.
Something like, well, you don't have, just because it's this, or maybe it was Shermer, so just because it's this doesn't mean you have to jump to it being alien. And I agree with that.
Well, I agree with it, too. It takes, I don't say it likely that it's alien, but if you have something that, judging by its appearance as reported by witnesses and radar visual cases and all forth, is manufactured, it's not a bunch of gas. And if it, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, it's probably a duck. If it is able to move in ways that we can't move, hover, right-angle turns at high speed. What's interesting about the right-angle turns is they don't slow down before the corner.
Right.
We do. Now, if it works by a magneto-aerodynamic principle, then you might not need to slow down. It's like magneto-forming. You can slap metal into a die to change its shape. And if you zap it with a high magnetic field for a very short period of time, so you don't splatter the die, it's the same with how much acceleration you can stand. It turns out you can stand 30 Gs for 1 second.
Really?
That's 0 to 600 miles an hour in 1 second. I'm not volunteering, but there is data from NASA about that. And as a matter of fact, Dr. Colonel Stapp, I guess he was, he did a lot of tests on rocket sleds, see what kind of acceleration you could stand,
Mm-hmm.
And one of the tests got a little out of hand. It got up to over 600 miles an hour and stopped in 3/4 of a second.
Ooh. And this was a manned sled on one of those tracks?
Dr. Stapp, yeah.
Uh-huh.
And he took 43 Gs for a very brief moment. His eyeballs hurt like hell, but he lived another umpteen years after that. So one has to be very careful about generalizations. If you're going to talk about how many Gs you can stand, it depends on three things: the magnitude of the acceleration, the direction of the acceleration with regard to the body. Have you noticed that the astronauts go up on their back?
Mm-hmm.
That's because we can stand a lot more acceleration back to front than foot to head.
Mm.
Your knees and hips don't like being zapped, so to speak. And the third thing is the duration of the acceleration. A trained pilot can perform a tracking task when being accelerated at 14 Gs for 2 minutes. That's an acceleration of about 300 miles an hour a second. And they run these tests on what do you call these things? That
yeah, the centrifugal.
Centrifugal devices, yeah. Centrifuges.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
And so we've learned a lot about acceleration. And I've tried a little experiment. I often get to talk to physics colloquia or physics group meetings or whatever on campuses. And when I've been warned that Dr. Jones thinks you're full of crap, or words to that effect, I make sure I give a little presentation, and I talk about things that I feel almost certain they don't know anything about, like the electromagnetic submarine. You're all familiar with that. I put a drawing on the board. Of course, none of them are. And I talk about the nuclear rocket engine, and they don't know about that either. I said, well, here's one that I'm sure you can answer. What's the numerical equivalent of 1G acceleration? 9.8 meters per second squared. They all know that. Mm. I said, well, how about in units that we normally use? And they look at me like I'm talking Swahili. They said, well, 1G is 21 miles per hour per second. Just think of an automobile. If you're accelerating at 1G in 3 seconds, you're going 63 miles an hour. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty hot car because most cars take longer than 3 seconds to get to that. And then I say, what's the speed of light? 300,000 kilometers per second. I said, well, again, can you put that in reasonable units? That's 670 million miles an hour. Mm. Now, I said, now the real question is a multiple-choice question. So I give you a chance to guess. How long does it take at 1G to get to the speed of light? And the choices are 1,000 years, 100 years, 10 years, or 1 year. How many think it's 1,000? A bunch of hands go up. How many think it's 100, 10, and 1? The right answer is 1.
1 year.
1 year at 1G gets you to the speed of light, close to the speed of light. I'll be careful about that.
Yeah.
And also, they want to forget about the other half of what Einstein said. He not only said that the speed of light's the limit, but he also said as you get close to the speed of light, time slows down for things moving that fast. Mm-hmm. And how much it slows down depends on how fast you're going. It turns out that at 99.99% of the speed of light, it would take only about a year, I think it is, to go 37 light years. And people say, well, let's not talk about close to the speed of light. Well, the particles at the Large Hadron Collider, 99.9999% of the speed of light. So you go out, come back, marry your granddaughter's best friend, and life goes on.
One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about tonight was what you thought about Hillary Clinton. I mean, she seems pretty sincere. I don't know if you paid any attention to...
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, remember, John Podesta's been saying these things for years. But I think some of the press coverage has neglected to mention that she always throws in a kicker if it doesn't violate national security. Mm-hmm. She's very careful about that. And so I think it does violate national security. And so I don't think she's going to get very far with that. Look, what it would take is fairly straightforward, I think, to blow the lid off the cosmic Watergate. You need a Woodward and Bernstein. You show those 156 NSA documents. You show a bunch of CIA top secret plus documents that by their definition are UFO documents. And then you say, what else gives here? There's plenty of other testimony around, but documents are pretty straightforward. And you quote General Bollinger. Now, I've never seen any major publication mention what Bollinger said. I mean, I've got a copy of the memo, and I don't think there's any question about where it came from. You realize the Air Force has been saying Blue Book was it, and the only group that was investigating UFOs, and there's no national security implications? That goes down the tubes if you read Bollinger's memo.
You mentioned John Greenwald earlier, and
yes.
his document.
Young man.
Yes, he is. And I actually mentioned to him, because the first show I did with you 3.5 years ago or something like that, I asked you who was the next Stanton Friedman, and you mentioned you thought it would be him. And I told that to him, and I'll tell you what, he really was moved by that. This is when I met him out in Phoenix.
Oh,
he thought that was really nice. Now, one of the things he uncovered was, I believe, a document, I want to say it was NORAD or something, that had some type of, there was some type of line in one of the documents about reporting UFOs. And out since the 1990s or something now. I may be off on the date. But are you familiar with that?
Not offhand, because there's an awful lot of documents out there.
Oh, yes. Yeah. But in other words, if no one else is interested in it, why would they have it? That was kind of the gist of that whole document.
Well, you talk to pilots and military pilots, and they don't want to talk about UFOs. They're afraid of losing their rank, or, if they're private pilots or airline pilots, they don't want to. They know that they're in for trouble.
Right.
The fear of God's been put into them, if you will.
Yes. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, Stan, was back. I can't remember the year it was exactly, but I'm talking about the Chicago O'Hare incident. Really an amazing case and all that. And why do you think that no one has, after all this time, I mean, people leave the career of, say, if they're doing baggage or something like that, people do leave the career of flight, working at the airport, or even, someone involved in other aspects of who could have actually seen that. They were all told not to talk about it. Why do you think no one's ever come forward since that time?
I know John Hilkovich, who worked for I don't know him personally, but I know of John Hilkovich, who worked for the Chicago Trib. And he did a fine article, and it got more hits on their website than anything that they had published. So he was very well received, and he got calls from all over the world from people wanting to talk to him about it. And people are the fear. There are two kinds of fear that are involved with UFOs. One is the ridicule factor. When I check my audiences at the end of my lecture, I ask, make a joke or two, but I'll ask, how many of you believe you've seen what I would consider to be a flying saucer?
With breaking news, the giant green fireball streaking...
Sorry about that.
Oh, I was going to say, gee.
Someone sent a link for me to look at, and I didn't know it was going to open to a movie. This is someone in the chat room. Thank you, Matt, for that. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, where was I?
We were talking about the O'Hare and the gentleman that wrote the article.
Yeah, John Hilkovich. And he got more response for that than anything. It led the list for 4 days at the Trib on the website. But the thing is that the ridicule factor is important on the one hand. When I ask my audiences how many have seen a flying saucer, and I say, I don't want your name, just raise your hand, and I just will point and count. And when I do that, the hands go up reluctantly off to my left, each one thinking he's the only one, And I do 1, 2, 3, 4, pointing and counting. By the time I get off to my far right, they go up vigorously.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, it's 10% of the audience.
Hmm.
It's easy to count, and I ask the guy who arranged things how many people does this room hold, but then I do something else. How many of you reported what you saw?
Right.
90% of the hands go down.
Mm-hmm.
If there's anybody left, I'll say, how many of you were in the military at the time? If there's still some hands up, you want to tell us about it? I got one guy in front of 1,300 people at East Texas State University who said, I can't. They told me not to say anything. It was a great line. At Indiana University in Indianapolis, the guy said, they took my pictures. Dead silence. So I said, look, I'm sure the audience would like to hear more about this. I'm not asking your name. You don't need to stand up. Somebody brought him over a microphone. And everybody clapped when I said, I think they'd like to hear about this. And he sat there quietly telling us that he was flying an Air Force plane out over the Pacific, a 4-engine plane. There was another plane ahead of them, 20 miles, radioed back saying that there was a saucer there heading their way. They had gun cameras. They took pictures. They called the base to which they were flying, informed them, because the crew doesn't handle that stuff. That's intelligence stuff. And when they land, the film gets taken, they get debriefed and told not to say anything. And I guarantee you 98% of the people in that hall believed him. He was obviously not trying to get attention or anything. He was being honest.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure he was surprised to see how many other people had sightings. So I tried the ultimate experiment in a class once with the cooperation of the professor. I said, look, I'd like to have the kids vote with their eyes closed, and you count the votes so that they won't be influenced by the other kids. And count them quietly, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And so I asked 2 questions. How many of you think most people don't believe in flying saucers? And then the second question was, how many of you do believe in flying saucers? Would you believe I got 80% in response to both questions?
Wow.
So what I'm saying is I've given over 700 lectures. I've had 11 hecklers, 2 of whom were drunk. Can't remember the last time I had one. And I come on very strong. I'm not an apologist ufologist.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that people are ready, willing, and able to listen to the story, the truth. And I got asked by a journalist here in Canada saying, he saw something about me in the paper. He called me. He said, hey, look, we're having the annual meeting of the Canadian Journalists Association. That's not the right name, whatever it is. Down in St. John's, only 60 miles away. Would you be willing to talk to them? I said, sure. So I did. And he told me afterward, he said, I've never seen so many journalists change their mind about something so quickly. They just hadn't been aware of the huge amount of evidence there is. I talked about 5 large-scale scientific studies, and fewer than 2% had read any of them. So I made the point, So what I'm saying is, if we had a new Woodward and Bernstein kind of thing to go after things, and if a newspaper would make a serious effort to get them to come forth, I think you'd get a lot of reports, and you could blow the lid off it. I mean, if the Washington Post were to carry some of these whited-out documents on the front page, and some of the blacked-out CIA documents, that are by their definition UFO documents, that's what it says when you get them, don't you think that there'd be more people coming forward? I think there would be.
Mm-hmm.
And the real question is, are we prepared? The Eisenhower briefing document says there was a contingency plan for informing things, and I would have to believe that there was. You got to have cover stories for hot stuff. Many people don't realize when the first atom bomb was exploded at Trinity site in New Mexico in 1945, July, it was a great success. It was seen from 100 miles away. The air is pretty clear in New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And so the sheriffs were getting called from all over the place. What happened? And they didn't say anything for a day or two, and then finally, I think it was on the third day, they mentioned that an ammunition dump had blown up. This is in the newspaper. Ammunition dump had blown up, and fortunately nobody was injured. 2 weeks later, a little over 2 weeks later, was Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Mm-hmm.
And then they put out the article saying that that had been the first atomic bomb which people had seen. And now I don't blame them in the slightest for keeping that secret.
Sure.
They were very worried that if the Japanese found out something was going on, they'd put prisoners there, let us kill our own people. And so sometimes you have to put out this information. Well, I'll give you another example. The British had broken the German codes early in World War II. And we were reading all their mail, so to speak, carefully. Now, there were 12,000 people at Bletchley Park in England whose job it was to intercept, that was easy, decode, that was difficult, translate, and then carefully distributed to a very limited group of people. And when the war was over, you think we said that's what was going on? It was 25 years later before we admitted that we'd broken the codes.
Wow.
25 years. There was a reason for it. Other people were using those same codes.
Oh, so we still wanted information.
We were looking for information.
Yeah.
And another example of a cover-up, we knew that the U-2 had a limited life, flying fairly low, if you will, over Russia.
And it did get shot down, or one of them.
Well, yeah, and we knew that was going to happen at some point in time. So we had started in the late 50s to develop a spy satellite, the Corona spy satellite. There were 12 failures. They launched 12 that failed. The 13th one worked in the 1960s and got more data about Soviet military installations than all the U-2 flights that had preceded it.
Really? Wow.
And it probably averted a war because we had been under the false impression that they had built a lot more than they had. Now, when do you think we told the world about Corona? 30 years later.
That many, wow.
Yeah, I mean, the Russians knew we were doing, but you see, we were breaking the law by flying the U-2 over Russia, violating Russian airspace. Satellites don't break the law by going over the countries that are below them. So it was legal. But we weren't about to make big noises about that success. And I mention it only because people think that secrets are easy to break, and when we have a triumph, we're going to tell everybody about it. That's just not how it works. On MJ-12, I had people insisting to me, Stan, now you got to admit that surely these guys would have told their wives what they were doing. No way.
Oh, I just heard
14 years, I never told my wife anything classified.
Yeah, I just had a conversation with someone that basically said he never told his wife anything. Wasn't supposed to. Never did.
That's right.
Yeah.
You violate the law, which puts you at risk, but also it might put the country at risk. Loose lips sink ships, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I heard that growing up. And I don't know of anybody who would blab to people without a clearance and a need to know. Spies, yes, but that's their job, you know. But it's people have an unrealistic understanding of how security works. It's very important. There's an awful lot of it. And war would happen more often, probably, if you thought you had knowledge that the other guy didn't know you had. And you knew his vulnerability. You knew how to take out his radar sets, let's say, just to pick something. You know, there's a risk. We're talking about a dangerous world. The military budget this year is $1 trillion.
Amazing.
$1 trillion. Look how many kids died of starvation yesterday. You know, I mean, So people, I've had people tell me that in today's world you can't keep a secret, Stan. You know, the internet, blogs, YouTube, no secrets. Apparently thinking that people post classified material on these places. They don't. I mean, I'm not saying people don't make mistakes from time to time, but there's an enormous amount of material that is around. Well, when I started checking on the NSC files at the Eisenhower Library because of Phil Klass and the college writing memo, they had 250,000 pages of NSC materials. The notion that it was all done on elite typewriters, because Phil Klass had 9 pages done that way, which he got by mail, makes no sense at all. You know, when you stop to think about it. Right. Typical of the intellectual bankruptcy of the pseudoscience of anti-ufology. I like the way that sounds.
Yeah, that does sound great. Now, we're getting toward the end of the show, and I wanted to, one of the things I thought I'd bring up with you on the fly here is, what do you think about technology? There's all these things that are out there. Recently, I was on Alejandro's show earlier this week, and we were talking about a new software that's out there where anybody can become a UFO detector by facing their cam out toward the sky and on this software, and you can train it so it'll tell what is a bird or a plane or something like that, and all this data.
Hey, that's great.
Yeah, and also, but there's all these different. There's the CubeSat. There's the UFOTOG that Mark D'Antonio and Doug Trumbull are working on. There's also the other one that Leslie Kane has some minor involvement, UFO data, the UFO detection and tracking. How do you think that's going to change this whole game of trying to figure out what these things are?
Well, look, there's no question that we know what they are, the important ones. Remember, the question isn't, are all UFOs alien spacecraft? The question is, are any?
Right. All it takes is one. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. So this may put some pressure on the government. And look, they've had a lot of years to think about, so where do we go from here? How do we change the world so that we inculcate into all the people here that we're not alone? And I think what's really changed things is the Kepler satellite, which suggests that there's probably, within 100 light years, 10,000 planets. And I don't meet anybody anymore who says, oh, there's no life out there, we're the only ones. That was a popular view 50, 100 years ago, you know, even more recently than that.
Right.
And so I think that the government knows that it can't keep this forever, but it wants to control how the secret gets released. And one of the big questions, I think you might have the Pope involved, who has said some very interesting things in the past, the previous Pope anyway.
Right.
But, and so at some point, I keep waiting for an announcement that, the Queen and the Pope get together and say, we have it on good authority that the planet's being visited. There are going to be international conferences about the implications of that. But people don't seem to understand. It changes everything. We have a common enemy, you can say, that means. But
yes.
So there are things that would change. How do we, there's that famous conversation between Gorbachev and Reagan. If there was a common enemy, we would work together. And so I think that there have to be people with contingency plans drawn up.
Even if it's not
crash in the middle of a city.
Right. Even if it's not an enemy, it still seems like we'd still want to globally work together to, whether it's communicate or understand more or whatever.
Or trade all the good stuff we have here. Who knows?
Now, when we talk about the government and cover-ups, are we thinking it's just a very small, compartmentalized section of the government and all need-to-know type of situation?
Well, I would think so, but I think they're independent little sections. You don't keep secrets by telling everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So you have rules at each installation, and you have a need to know and somebody who decides whether. Look, when I was working on radiation shielding for nuclear airplanes, I had access to secret restricted data. I found some listings in abstracts of research, nuclear abstracts, classified abstracts. The Navy was doing some interesting radiation shielding work. I tried to get those documents. I had the right clearance, but the nuclear Navy wouldn't give me need to know, wouldn't give me access. So it's strongly arranged. And, how long you can keep it up, I don't know. As I say, if any major media group made the effort, they could blow the lid off. But they better be prepared for the consequences.
Yeah, and you just don't see them going there when you're saying a major.
No.
Yeah.
Remember that at the beginning of World War II, within 2 weeks of Pearl Harbor Day, there was an Office of Censorship established. And a censorship czar was appointed. I can't remember his name, but there really was one. And, for example, things they couldn't talk about, the word uranium was prohibited to be used in the press.
I remember that. I remember hearing about that, yes.
Fugo balloons, the Japanese balloons which had bombs attached.
Right.
You couldn't talk about those because we didn't want them to know how successful or unsuccessful they were.
And those were supposed to, float over and drop, right, or something?
Well, they were sent from out in the Pacific, and the winds blow it over the United States, and they're supposed to land and explode. And one person was killed who started handling one that had come down, and it went off.
Yeah.
But we didn't find that out until later. And there were a few fires started, but not many. It didn't work very well, is the point. But it was not something that could be talked about by the people who knew anything about it.
Yeah. We do have a question up on the message board, and that is from Matthew. He wanted to know, are you convinced that alien abductions are a real phenomenon? And if so, why?
Because the evidence is overwhelming. Read the book by Kathleen Martin and myself, Captured. We go into gory detail about the abduction of Betty and Barney Hill. And one of the important things about that, and many people don't realize, is the psychiatrist who did the hypnosis sessions, and there were 10 each, separately. Neither one was present when the other one was being done, was Dr. Benjamin Simon. Now, he was the world's expert on what today then it was there's another name for it, but anyway, he's the world's expert on what do you call it? Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Oh, right.
PTSD.
Yeah. From the war.
Shell shock war veterans. That's what I was trying to think of. And he ran an Army hospital that had 3,000 beds for veterans coming back who, their buddy's head was blown off next to them. Well, that's hard to integrate. Why him and not me? And they're still coming back with PTSD. And as a matter of fact, a higher percentage because the medical care is better. So they would have died, early on. But now we can keep them alive. But it's difficult. It's traumatic. And so when Dr. Simon says, as he did, in writing, that the emotional intensity of Betty and Barney as they relived their experiences for him was every bit as powerful as that of the shell shock war veterans. Coming from him, that means something. It means a great deal. And the Army made a movie, Let There Be Light, starring Dr. Simon. in which he explained how he'd worked out this treatment. Well, it was a major problem. What are we going to do? We got all these guys coming back, and they're basket cases in some cases. You know, we've got to do something for them. They've been traumatized. And so he worked out techniques that worked. So the fact that he did the hypnosis is very, very important. And he didn't know anything about flying saucers, but that wasn't the point.
Now, what about, we had someone call in that said she spoke with Dr. Simon, and Dr. Simon said that he didn't actually believe that they were actually abducted.
He made a number of comments, and we included a lot of these in the book. And we've looked at his papers, which are in the Harvard archives. And he was caught in a very crazy situation. Neither the Hills nor Dr. Simon wanted that story to come out. Somebody broke the confidence. They secretly taped a little lecture that Betty and Barney had given, passed it on to a reporter, and he calls Betty and says, I want to interview you guys. About what? About your abduction. Absolutely not. And they thought they'd lose their jobs. But Dr. Simon had to worry about medical ethics.
Now, how did that tape get out?
Somebody, and Kathy knows the name of the person. I don't remember it. She thought it was a great story, and she gave it to this reporter.
Oh, my goodness.
What can I tell you? And it was very distressing to Betty and Barney and Dr. Simon. And so I'm convinced that he was the best person in the world probably to do what was done, even though he didn't know anything about flying saucer. But and if you listen to the tapes, the terror in their voices on occasion is quite clear.
I have listened to some of them, and you're absolutely right. It's hard. They're hard to listen to.
Well, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. And remember, the last thing they wanted was publicity. This is a mixed-race couple in 1961 to the hypnosis in 62, 63, in New Hampshire. And Barney was very active in civil
conservative.
rights.
Yeah.
Well, he was very active in civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
And something like this is the last thing they needed.
That's right. Stan, we're at the end of our time. Can you throw out your website, please?
Yeah, www.stantonfriedman.com. That's FRIEDMAN.com. And all my books are there. DVDs are there. You get autographs with the books and stuff. You can use PayPal. It's easy. And on the website, you'll find background, too. There's a bio and a phone number and, all that stuff. I don't hide.
Yeah.
I don't give out my phone number on the air because it would be distressing if the phone started.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Stan. It's always a pleasure, and I look forward to the next time we speak.
Okay. I'll look forward to it, too. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
All right.
Thanks.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much for listening. And if you're listening this far, you're either supporting the show or you're listening on the live show or you're listening on the Dark Matter Digital Network. And I appreciate that. Our guest next week, I will be in Russia, but I'll be doing the show live from there with Ryan Mullahy about New Hampshire UFOs, a couple of new things that he has found through Pease Air Force Base and all that. And I'd like to thank a few people for helping out. Peggy for managing the Facebook page, Carrie Lloyd Whitehouse for the music, and all the other people. Alejandro should be back next week. He is having a difficult time doing the show live with his schedule. We may have to pre-record like we did before, but still, I expect him back next week. And I want to thank you, the listener, and we will see you next week. Remember to keep your eyes to the sky and your curiosity high.